shout out so that I will know. Okay, like Hitesh has introduced me. My name is Judy Kepher Gona. I'm from Kenya. I'm born, bred, educated in Kenya. I am a sustainable tourism professional. I've worked in conservation, communities, and tourism in Kenya and larger Africa for the last more than 22 years. I now run a consultancy firm. My passion is in finding the linkages and the best balance between tourism, biodiversity conservation, and communities. I have a bias for communities or resident communities because they always seem to be left behind in the equation when we're talking about tourism, conservation, and communities in Africa. It's always, the order is always tourism, conservation, communities. But and that is in a ranking order. My agenda in my profession is to break this ranking so that communities, if they are not in the front, they can at least be equal, be given equal focus as tourism is given and as conservation has been given in Africa. So I'm going to share some insights on wildlife, biodiversity conservation, and tourism in Africa. And then we can have a discussion for a few minutes. So my presentation will probably last the next half an hour because we have spent already some time. So, okay. Every time you hear about wildlife conservation or wildlife-based tourism in Africa, the picture that is presented is some things, a picture like what you see on my screen now. It's always about wildlife. It's always about the big five in Eastern and Southern Africa. This is what you see in the forefront as the image of wildlife conservation in Africa. You will see the elephant. You read a lot of stories about the elephants, the rhinos, the big mammals, and great things like the migration. The picture you see here is the world-renowned wildebeest migration that happens between Serengeti and Masai Mara National Park in Kenya every year. Over the years, the numbers of this wildebeest used to be, here in the 60s, it used to be million, probably a million wildebeest and zebras will be migrating on this route every once in a year. Today, the numbers are said to be a few hundreds of thousands. Some scientists and research put it as just about 200,000. And that by itself tells us that something has changed. But despite those changes, your tourism still just likes to tell the good story. So you will still see images that were taken of migration in the 80s and the 70s, doing the rounds when tourism is being promoted. But the story is so different today because a lot of things have happened. The spaces have been lost, boundaries have been created, and human activities along the way have affected how the migration happens. And more recently, we know that slowly by slowly, without the world realizing, there have been the impacts of climate change. And sometimes climate change has confused this wildlife. We'll talk about it later on, where instead of migrating, they stayed in one place. Excuse me. So here are some, I'll grab some water, just a moment. Let's get choked. So here are some facts on wildlife tourism in Africa. This is what I call the good report about wildlife tourism in Africa. And the good report is that Africa holds about a quarter of the world's biodiversity, and some of the world's largest mammals, a large percentage of them are found in Africa, and they form the backbone of wildlife tourism in Africa. From a World Bank report in 2015, and combined with the WTTC reports in 2018, they have some very impressive figures about wildlife tourism in Africa. It's like 80% of experiences to Africa are for wildlife watching. Those who come to Africa for tourism, it says that 80% of them come for some form of wildlife watching. 36% of GDP in many economies in Africa is contributed by wildlife tourism. And there's so many people that are employed in Africa from wildlife tourism. The numbers are at 3.6 million, and that is direct and indirect employment. And the revenues are 23.9 billion. These are from statistics from Africa Union, United Nations World Tourism Organization, and WTTC. And some of it we picked from the World Bank data. So we can see that when it comes to economic contribution of wildlife tourism to African economies, it is huge, it is substantial, and therefore it cannot be ignored. The states in tourism where wildlife is and where they benefit from wildlife tourism cannot ignore them. The numbers that I wanted to share but are not in my slides today is some research that was done by Wildlife Concern. And in this research, Wildlife Concern wanted to establish how much of the tourism dollar goes to the community or is retained in host communities. Despite these impressive figures that show the significance of wildlife tourism in Africa, how much of this is retained in resident communities? And the sad situation, which is part of not the too good report, shows that 0.00, less than 0.000% of every dollar spent is left in the host community. What that means is that whereas the wildlife tourism numbers, economic numbers are impressive, there is a completely different story when it comes to the impact on the lives of the host communities. Everything else keeps leaking out of communities. And so this revenue that we see, these impressive numbers, including the people who are employed in tourism in Africa, it's only in the last 15 years or 20 at most in Eastern and Southern Africa that a new model of wildlife conservation and wildlife tourism emerged in Africa that is now directly benefiting communities. And we call it the community wildlife conservancies. These are conserved areas that are owned by community under the traditional land ownership models. In Kenya, we called it the group ranch model, where pastoralist communities were bundled into particular areas by the colonial administration. And they were given a single title to hundreds of thousands of acres of land because the colonial administration did not understand the pastoralist lifestyle, and they could not stop them from moving from one place to another in search of pasture. So they created a new land tenure system, which they called the group ranch system. And in the group ranch system, they bundled pastoral communities like the Maasai and the Samburu into large tracts of land and were allocated one title, and ownership of that land was therefore communal. And anybody, any son or the boys who were born in that community became owners of that land as they grew older. That land model is changing in Kenya today. A lot of the communities are asking government to consider and allow them to subdivide that land so that they can have access to individual use of land and use land for their own economic needs the way they need to do it. But I was talking about the community wildlife conservancies, which is a new phenomenon for wildlife tourism and wildlife conservation in Africa, which is now bringing direct benefits to communities through a system that is called a land lease system. In this land lease system of conservation, the communities are actually leasing the land to tourism operators, so that instead of operating in protected areas around where communities live, the communities have created their own protected areas and have invited tourism operators to come and operate in their land. So they're earning revenue directly from leasing the land to tourism operators, as opposed to waiting for a handout from the government or from the national or state protected areas. So these numbers and figures could change when we look at the community conserved areas and how they are benefiting communities today, because there is direct employment, there is direct revenue from land lease, and there's additional revenue for selling of bed nights. Some other important statistics that we could look at when we're talking about wildlife tourism in Africa is that Africa has over 7,000 recognized protected areas. This is in the IUCN list of protected areas. So those are true, really protected areas under the state. These numbers does not include the community conserved areas. If we were to use Kenya as an example, the community conserved areas in Kenya over the last 20 years have grown and are almost a quarter in size, even growing into a half in size of protected areas in Kenya. So we could confidently add maybe another 3,000 to this number and have the community conserved areas included as protected areas. Because in Kenya in 2014, those community conserved areas became recognized as protected areas. And even within IUCN, there's now a recognition of community conserved areas, and their numbers are now listed amongst the community conserved areas. But this number of 7,000 does not include community protected areas. In my statement, it says it's include community owned areas, but I just checked that again. It does not include community owned areas. That's a different number altogether. So countries whose GDP benefit the most from wildlife tourism in Africa today, it's Botswana, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, there's Namibia in there, Kenya and Zambia. There are other destinations that are now emerging. Malawi is coming up very strongly. It is touted to be the next wildlife experience area in Central Africa. It is opening up. The Congos could have opened up, except that they have been in conflict. The DRC Congo, they have been in conflict for a long time. Also coming up very strongly and not in this list is Uganda and Rwanda, that are doing very well with wildlife tourism today. Recovering from conflicts, Rwanda has restored some of its national parks. Akagera is the best examples. They have brought in wildlife from other African countries, wildlife that had been lost because of the conflict periods where they went through conflict. So they're doing a lot of restoration programs, and they want to do more than the gorillas. So they have introduced the Big Five in Akagera National Park. So that is a mode of management. Reintroduction of wildlife is very popular in African countries, in areas where certain species have been extinct for whatever reason, whether it is through conflict or other means. They are being rebuilt through reintroduction. And that means that sometimes you will find a number of wildlife breeding areas or breeding zones in these African countries that are able to restock those areas that have lost their wildlife for one reason or another. I started by talking about, sorry, it went, yeah. I started by talking about the good story, but we also have what I call the challenging report about wildlife tourism in Africa. The not so good reports, you will always find them in headlines, like what we can see on the screen, like the tribes paying the brutal price of conservation. You hear stories, ecotourism is being used to displace communities. So there are stories on the backside of wildlife conservation. You hear a lot of stories of displacement of communities in Africa for creation of protected areas. Some of it happened in colonial times. Some of them are as recent as within this decade. We also have a lot of disputed areas where wildlife lives alongside communities, and communities are unable to benefit from that wildlife and the protection that states that they have. And they bear the brand, the brutal price, like this headline says. And one of the brutal prices that communities pay and communal tribes pay for wildlife conservation is human-wildlife conflict, where communities are not compensated for loss of life or loss of property from interactions with wildlife. People lose their lives a lot to buffaloes in protected areas and areas around protected areas, to elephants. A lot of them, it is said that a lot of people who live around protected areas lose their lives to snakes. They lose their lives to crocodiles, those who live along the waters. And all these are protected species. And if you are found to have, if you kill this wildlife, you really have to prove that you are killing it in defense. And the penalties for killing of wildlife are higher, much, much higher for communities if you're found to be culpable of having killed wildlife. So we have a lot of human-wildlife conflict in many forms. Sometimes the elephants, buffaloes, they raid farms. People lose all their, and they have to be faced with hunger, and there is no compensation for this kind of conflict. So we know that there's the challenging report. What do you call the invisible impact of wildlife tourism and wildlife conservation in Africa? It's the untold story, the impact, what is under those beautiful images that Prasam have shared with you of wildebeest migration, of magnificent lions, of the giraffes and of the elephants and the buffaloes and the big five and the cheetah, and all this. Behind this, there's another story that is not oftenly told, and sometimes the bottom that is hidden under the ground stays on the ground because it is so heavy, and there's not many people who have the willingness and the voice to bring it up and to talk about it, because the dollars that drive tourism and drive conservation are so big, and they muzzle the community voices and all the other voices that speak for the community, because they are not funded. Those voices don't receive as much funding, and those voices have no economic power to be able to express themselves. So these are just a few headlines. The ugly of conservation is when you have the stories. I hope you'll find it and read it. The blood lions that are bred for the bullet. This has been a contentious issue for a long time. And these lions are just bred so that somebody can come and shoot them and hunt and pay a big price for them. And the conditions under which the breeding happens, if I could use the word inhuman, or those they're not humans, but they're not humane conditions. It is not dignifying for wildlife. It is, and so there has been cries about not just the blood lions, but they're blood lions, but there are other wildlife held in captivity just to satisfy the interest of a certain kind of traveler who wants to just travel and come and shoot a lion and pose with a trophy. So there are many issues that are hidden behind the story of wildlife tourism and conservation in Africa, and that is the challenging report. So many times there's the state of the community or the plight of the community is not highlighted. Now, I find these pictures very powerful. You've got the face of a community on one end, and then you've got wildlife on the other end. And in between are the real people and the real issues. One, tourism in an area where the communities don't have water, and that little boy has to go down on his belly to drink water that is not clean, that is stagnated water from rain, and that water is shared by livestock, and it's not healthy water to drink. Next to that place, you will find a high-end tourism facility where tourists have all the waters and have all the views. So this is the irony of tourism and communities, where tourism has everything and communities have nothing, and yet that tourism is built on the backbone of communities who bear the brunt of living with that wildlife, who bear the brunt of keeping these places that we call pristine and that are destinations good enough for tourism to happen. And once they're good enough for tourism to happen, communities pushed out. And tourism has access to what the community does not have, including a basic human right, which is access to clean water. So those are the issues, the contentious issues around. When I talk about my work has been involved in finding the link and a good balance between tourism, wildlife conservation, and communities, so that communities can be at the forefront. We change the equation and have communities at the forefront so that we have happy communities and we have a healthy environment. Then we can have happy tourists and happy businesses. So this quote I found in one of the World Bank group reports, and it summarizes what we're talking about, is where there's community apathy, disengagement, and hostility, this can cause tourism and conservation initiatives to fail. And there are many examples. Time will not allow us today, but there are many examples of tourism that has failed because of community apathy, disengagement, and hostility, where communities have actually told tourism to go away and leave them in peace. But where communities are engaged and benefiting, sustainable wildlife tourism can be a win-win for everyone. And that is the search, that is where wildlife tourism should be heading to, a win-win for community, for everyone, for communities, for planet, that's for wildlife, and for the economy, so that we have sustainable tourism. So coming to COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 on wildlife tourism in Africa, nothing changed. It is the same as any other tragedy that would face African countries at different times when there's conflict in countries, because tourism in Africa has been built on a lot on foreign tourism, international tourists. So whether we are talking wildlife tourism or other forms of tourism across Africa, anytime there is a challenge in the destinations, we have loss of jobs, we have loss of income, and then the traditional threats to tourism and wildlife conservation emerge. And the biggest threat to wildlife conservation is poaching. Now, it is argued that tourism raises money that pays rangers, that then contributes to protection of wildlife in protected areas. Another fact that I wanted to share, and I believe it is true for many African countries, that in Kenya, it has been established through research that 70% of our wildlife does not live in state protected areas, which means 70% of the wildlife that is used to support tourism is roaming freely on people's lands, on community lands, and there is no systems for direct benefit for this community. So the impacts of COVID-19 were just exaggerated because the impact lasted longer than the other situations where we have had, including insecurity, terrorist attacks. Kenya has been a victim more than once, several times, but this has lasted for a while, a little while, maybe a year. COVID has lasted a little longer. So the impacts of it are being felt more strongly. And at this particular time, it's very interesting. And I want to say this, that I have seen a lot of initiatives to raise money during COVID times, to raise money for conservation, to make sure that wildlife is safe. I have seen very few initiatives to raise money to support the communities that have lost income because there is no more wildlife jobs and one tourist income, to support those communities and give them basic living. And that tells you that this equation that we've been trying to turn around for decades, is still, there's a strong inclination to value tourism, to value wildlife more than tourism. And this is a conversation is anyway. They will always tell you that we feel like emphasis is given to wildlife more than given to the people. And this is an example that I hear all the time when I'm doing community research and talking to people. They say, they use this analogy and they say, if one of us is attacked by wildlife and we call for help from the wildlife authorities to come evacuate them to a medical facility, we will not get help. The helicopter will not land here and pick that person and rush them to hospital. But if there is a call that the animal wildlife has been speared, or there's an incident of poaching, and maybe an elephant is discovered that there was an attempt for poaching, and you will see 3 or 5 helicopters in less than 30 minutes, and it will be taken away, and there will be a whole operation to comb the area and all that. And so they say, how will wildlife survive without people? Is wildlife more important than the people? We live with this wildlife on our land. We give them space to roam on our land. They share the space with our livestock, but they are valued more than we are. So the impact of COVID-19 almost brought these feelings again. People were thinking there's money that is being raised all over for wildlife protection, but there's no money that is being raised, and there are no efforts that are going towards sustaining communities that have become dependent on tourism during this time, to the extent that some communities who are in community wildlife conservancies were beginning to question whether they made the right decisions. I am finishing so that we can allow for some few minutes of discussion. So what are the main threats to wildlife-based tourism in Africa? We've got climate change. I've mentioned climate change has contributed to loss of pasture in many places because of extended drought. Wildlife has been pushed into smaller areas, human population, fencing of land, alternative land uses that are not compatible anymore with conservation and wildlife free spaces for wildlife, because people don't benefit. People are fencing their land and there's no more free movement of wildlife. The wildlife that depends on range are being lost very quickly and very fast because of growth in population and therefore competing use for land. Then we also got species loss and poaching. Although this has been controlled in many African countries, it still remains a threat. And we know that the northern white rhino, we've got the last 2 females living in Kenya. They have been, they're almost extinct. And that whole species has been lost mainly due to poaching in Africa. We've got human development needs, government projects and agendas that are threatening wildlife-based tourism in Africa. We've got infrastructure projects that have infringed in protected areas. We've got railway lines and roads going through protected areas. We've got waterfalls and being dammed for hydroelectricity and losing all those spaces for tourism. So infrastructure projects and government development agendas are also a threat to wildlife and wildlife-based tourism in Africa. Sustainable tourism that is not sustainable is a threat to itself and to wildlife protection. We know that part of the challenges of the migration, or wildebeest migration between Tanzania's national park, Serengeti and Kenya, is because of unsustainable tourism practices, where we have facilities located in the wrong places. They're blocking the wildebeest migration routes, they're recreating routes. There's a lot of erosion from overuse of land, from off-road driving in protected areas, and yet the land is very fragile. We also have a threat from human-wildlife conflicts. I've already mentioned that. When communities decide to retaliate, they will normally kill wildlife. And I have said in Kenya, 70% of wildlife lives outside of state protected areas. Last but not least, we have what we call the elite capture of conservation and tourism in Africa. Conservation and tourism in Africa is not in the hands of host communities and residents. It's in the hands, the decisions, the use, the utilization is by a few, and those few benefits immensely from wildlife conservation and wildlife-based tourism in Africa. And this exclusion has caused a sense of apathy, so that even when development projects are happening across protected areas, the residents are saying they don't care whether that biodiversity is being lost because it is only a few people who benefit from tourism. This is a whole discussion area that we can talk about, the forms of elite capture of conservation and tourism in Africa. I'm almost coming to an end, my discussion. Sometimes the key questions that you find being asked in wildlife and conservation and tourism is whether tourism supported wildlife conservation in Africa is sustainable. Should wildlife conservation be dependent on tourism? That is a key question and a discussion that happens many times. And again, the other one that I say is the one that says that it always seems like there's a focus on biodiversity conservation and tourism, wildlife tourism. And if this is true, there's who is the priority people, the space, tourism, or the wildlife? Yeah, who actually benefits from this? These are discussions that are happening over and over. I have been in this industry for more than 20 years, going to 25. The questions have never changed. And the other one is, who is the public in wildlife and biodiversity conservation in Africa? It's actually asking who owns those assets, who control them. And that's why I say that elite capture is a problem of wildlife conservation and wildlife-based tourism in Africa. I think I have come to the end of my slides. Something happened and we missed the last one. But yes, I will give the discussion back to you, Hitesh.
Very good. If you can unshare.
Okay. Yes, I will.
And then see if you want, if you can come on the screen, see if you can put your video on. We'll try and see if we're able to have you be there. Very good. Thank you so much for your most insightful yet succinct presentation. You are definitely the voice of the communities, a voice for the communities. And we truly appreciate you going out and fighting for our brothers and sisters in Kenya and other places. We have got about 10 minutes. So what we're going to do is I will have the student come in because the people are wearing masks and all that. So we're going to have them come here and ask you the question. And then if you can repeat the question, because you are on the speaker system, you can repeat the question and then answer it. Yes? Okay, very good. Who wants to come?
Okay.
Anybody? Yes, can you come here, please, if you don't mind? So Deadin is going to ask you a question. He's originally from Palestine and Jordan. So Deadin.
I wanted to clarify. You mentioned that. You mentioned there was a news article saying that the tribes were paying the brutal price of conservation, but I didn't understand or hear why that was. If you can just clarify, please.
Did you hear his question?
Okay. Yes, the question is what is meant by the tribes are paying the brutal price of conservation. You recall I mentioned an example, which I said probably is the case in most wildlife countries that are dependent on wildlife